We begin tonight with breaking news out of New York City, where disgraced former Congressman Chris Collins was just sentenced 26 months in prison a few minutes ago. Now, that was for his role in an insider trading case involving lying to the FBI, and that sentence came down nearly 3 hours of arguments.
And the debate inside a lower Manhattan courtroom that began just before 3 o'clock. And good evening once again, I'm Scott Levin.
And I'm Mary Alice Demler. Two on your sides. Michael Wooten was inside the courtroom all afternoon. We'll get to him in just a moment. But let's start with legal analysis from Barry Covert and Tom Ioannou. Guys, Barry, first of all, what did you think of the sentencing?
I thought that Chris Collins really saved the day. His comments to the court where he said, I have no one to blame but myself. He took full responsibility for ruining his son's life, for ruining his family, for harming his constituents, for harming the Boy Scouts. He could never be a Boy Scout again. His son can never be a Boy Scout again. And especially when he said, Judge, save your leniency, not for me, but for my son. That's what judges want to hear. The judge had a real problem with the legal papers that were submitted by his lawyers, and they caused the judge to say, I really want to address these issues, such as saying that your congressional district was not harmed. I believe it was, because they're unrepresented right now, saying that it was just a passion of the moment to make this lie up. Yet 10 months later, you lied to the FBI again, so it wasn't just a sudden mistake. So Chris was able to put all that behind him and really tell the judge, I'm taking responsibility. He was very emotional about it. And I think he really saved himself. I think he hopefully got a lower sentence because of that.
Excellent analysis. And Tom, your thoughts also on this. I mean, the judge really sounds like he did an excellent job today.
I believe the judge did a very thorough and a very excellent job. What happens is sometimes lawyers lawyer, which means you submit volumes on behalf of the prosecution, volumes on behalf of the defense, and the judge goes through it. But in a unique case like this, 69 years old with a stellar record, and then an impulsive lie and a lie to the FBI, in some cases that judge has to eyeball the defendant and hear from him. And that's what happened today, and Chris Collins carried the day.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Don't go away. We're going to get back to you. We're going to go right now, though, to Michael Wooten, who is in Lower Manhattan. He was in the courtroom, and we're still waiting for Chris Collins to come out. Isn't that right, Michael?
Looks like that might be it right there. This is a live picture.
Chris, do you have anything you want to say to the constituents who didn't get to hear you inside?
Go back to Buffalo and speak to your constituents there. Anything to say to them?
That was our Michael Wooten right there asking Chris
All right,
Collins
guys, Chris
if he had
Collins
anything to say.
now getting into an SUV. Yeah, he did not say anything, guys, as he walked past here. He did say inside the courtroom at the time just before his sentencing that he doesn't think he'll ever make another public statement. He said, again, as we said earlier, that he cannot go back to Western New York. He said he's living with the shame of what he has done. Just to kind of give you a sense of what was really happening here before the judge announced this 26-month sentence, Chris Collins gave about as full-throated an apology as you can imagine. And as Barry Covert said a moment ago, you imagine that probably shaved some time off of this sentence. He apologized to his family. That was when he got the most emotional. He apologized to his constituents. He apologized to his colleagues in government, apologized to his former business associates, to the Boy Scouts. He even apologized to the FBI. He said, I lied to the FBI. That was the crime that I committed. And he told the judge, as we had mentioned earlier, to save his leniency for his son. And that was one of the things when it got extremely emotional inside the courtroom. Chris Collins knows that his 27-year-old son also faces prison time and will live out the rest of his life as a convicted felon. Chris Collins noted that he is an older man, and he said he believes he's in his final years of life, whereas his 27-year-old son is very early in his life. That was when it got most emotional in that courtroom. But I can tell you, he said, Judge, I am standing here and I cannot face my constituents. People feel sorry for me, he said. They come up to him in restaurants or they see him in places, and he said they feel sorry for me. Quote, they shouldn't. I don't deserve your sympathy. And so, as he got this 26-month sentence inside federal court here, Chris Collins at that point kind of just stood there stone-faced and accepted the punishment. As we can see, since he came out of the courtroom here, he was not remanded. He'll be given an amount of time to turn himself in, and then he will serve about 2 years in federal prison. Guys?
Michael, now we were just reading some live tweets, but you were there to hear verbatim everything the judge had said. Did you get the sense that the judge was being very tough on Chris Collins' defense attorneys with the arguments that they were trying to make for leniency?
You know, this was a long hearing. I think it was longer than a lot of us expected. There was some back and forth between prosecutors and the defense attorneys making some legal cases about, all right, should the judge factor in this? Should the judge factor in that? That went on for quite a while, and then Chris Collins' defense attorney made a pretty lengthy legal argument, and it was then at that point that Chris Collins was able to speak to the judge. Just before handing down the 26-month sentence, the judge said, look, you know, what you did here, first of all, is a serious crime. People were hurt by it, people who bought that stock after his son dumped it. He also said there is a need here for general deterrence, that people need to have faith in our financial system, and that Chris Collins' actions really cut at the heart of how our financial system works in this country. He did say that he's giving Chris Collins credit for, number one, being a public servant. He said that has nothing to do with politics. Interestingly, the judge multiple times said there is no political consideration at all in any of this, and he even at one point said he kind of wanted the public to know that. He got a lot of letters from people who maybe don't like Chris Collins' politics. He said that did not factor into any of this, but he considered Chris Collins' public service, and he considered Chris Collins' many good deeds. We know that Chris Collins did a lot for charity, very involved in the Boy Scouts, and so those things went in Chris Collins' favor in this sentence, but it was a pretty tough sentence handed down, 26 months in federal prison.
Michael, a couple of quick questions before we let you go. The judge also mentioned about the length of time for the lie. He seemed to be very upset about how much time went by until the congressman actually came out with that letter to say he was going to plead guilty. If you could talk about that, and also the fact that he said he may have thought about committing suicide.
Yeah, Scott, the argument from Chris Collins' defense team all along was this was an emotional mistake, that Chris Collins was very invested, not financially, but with his heart in this company. They thought they were going to have a cure for a very debilitating disease, and when he got that bad news that this drug trial had failed, that he made a stupid mistake and that it was emotional and that is what drove this. The prosecution said no, the trades lasted for several days, and then 10 months later Chris Collins lied to the FBI, and the judge said just before handing down the sentence that yeah, this was not just an emotional reaction, this was Chris Collins committing a crime over what turned out to be many months. The judge also made note here that Chris Collins' constituents are suffering to this day because they don't have representation in Congress, and that's because Chris Collins decided not to try to have his name taken off the ballot. He ran for re-election, and now essentially the people of the 27th district are suffering. And then just to your other question, it was really striking when Chris Collins talked about what he described as a very dark place that he had entered, and he said, I probably wouldn't be here if his daughter had not told him that she needed him in his life, that his grandkids needed him in their lives. And so Chris Collins making note there that he contemplated suicide, but that he was able to get through that, and that he now will live out the remainder of his time trying to make up for this horrible misdeed he committed.
An excellent job recapping what went on in the courtroom. Michael Wooten in the Southern District of New York, thank you so much for that. But there was so much to today's sentencing. It was really kind of a mini course for all of us in how the whole process of sentencing goes. But gentlemen, we want to talk about what probation recommended versus what the guidelines were, because there was a big disparity there going in, Barry.
Really an unbelievable disparity that I don't think Tom or I have ever seen, and certainly never in Buffalo. So the probation department is tasked with making a recommendation after they do a full investigation of the character, background of the defendant, the instant offense, all other relevant conduct in his life, and then they make a recommendation to the court as to what the sentence should be. So the agreed upon between the prosecution and the defense in the plea agreement, the agreed upon time was 46 at the low end, 57 at the high end, and that was the recommended sentencing range under the sentencing guidelines. The probation department, though, issued a recommendation of 1 year and 1 day, which by adding 1 day even brings it down to less than a year that he would serve.
That was a lot of outcry about that. People were really upset because that seemed like a slap on the wrist.
I've never seen that. That was remarkable. The probation department was essentially recommending 1/4 of the sentencing guidelines. Now, there has been recent legislation that we should consider for elderly defendants, less incarceration, but 1/4 was remarkable, and it really set a table of expectations that I think that the judge really had to go through the paces and show the public why he was not going to follow that recommendation.
So you think that was the reason why the judge went all these extra steps of explaining what his process was in deciding on the sentence?
I think so. I think he even said that when he said that he's concerned about the perception of all these people who wrote letters. I also think that it was caused in part by the lawyers for Collins saying some things that made it appear as though he was not taking full responsibility. He was blaming the situation, claiming that it was just an instant moment of a mistake, but yet 10 months later he lied to the FBI.
All right, we often talk about the scales of justice here. Tom, in your opinion, you've been a lawyer a long time. You've been in a lot of federal courthouses. Was justice done here for the crime?
I think so. I think it went as it should. There was a plea with a given range of 46 to 57 months. There was a probation report with a recommendation for a much lesser sentence. There was submissions by the government, the prosecution, submissions by the defense. The judge went all the way through that. He looked at the crime. Then he went to the 3553A factors. The guidelines are no longer binding, and he said, let's look at the nature and character of the defendant. And he did. Let's listen to what the defendant is saying, and he did. So ultimately, the system worked today.
Well, it bears mentioning that you had mentioned earlier that the judge was concerned about the Collins defense team appealing this. Do you think it's likely, quickly, that they would do that?
There's really no grounds to appeal.
He cannot appeal because it's not above the highest end of
They're pleased with it tonight.
Yes.
All righty, very good. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And stay with us. We will be back right after this quick break.